And you know, it takes on a whole different picture when you think of these 6 seals through the lens of Christ's love. People say, what kind of a loving God could allow this to happen on earth? A God who gave up his own life so that way each and every person can accept that free gift. It doesn't have to be that way. That's a choice. You know, some people think, because they've sat in these pews their whole life, that by being a pew sitter, I guess you get saved through osmosis. Or because your family were Christians, or you had a Bible-thumping grandma, that you're saved through her. No. It is only through an individual act of asking Christ into your heart that gives you salvation. It's that act from a loving Savior who's willing to stretch out these judgments for as long as possible so that the last person still has the choice to run to him. But we are doing a continuation with the book of Revelation. Now, I know, I've said the same thing to God. I'm like, really, God? This is Thanksgiving, and I'm supposed to do it on the 7 seals of the 4 horsemen and all doom and gloom. That just doesn't seem right. And then he showed me what we are to be grateful for, even in those times. So we're going to look at that a little more. I'm not going to read 6, 7, and 8. You can follow along in those ahead of time. We'll be looking at those later, but we're just going to focus on chapter 6 today. So Jesus is the Lamb, and he is the only one that's able to open the 7 seals. It says, I watched the Lamb open the first of the 7 seals, and then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say, in a voice of thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow and was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror and bent on conquest. Then the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, and I heard a 2nd living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other, and to him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, come. And I looked, and there before me was a black horse, and its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage. And do not damage the oil and the wine. And then the Lamb opened the 4th seal. And I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, come. And I looked, and there before me was a pale horse, and its rider was named Death, and Hades followed close behind him. And they were given power over the 4th of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by wild beasts of the earth. And when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar souls of those who had been slain because of God's testimony that they had maintained. And they called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? And each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters were killed just as they had been. And I watched as he opened up the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun turned to black like sackcloth made of goat's hair, and the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. And the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. And the kings of the earth and the princes and the generals, the rich, the mighty, everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks and the mountains. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. So what on earth does the Lamb and the seals and the 4 horses of the Apocalypse have to do with Thanksgiving? And why should we be thankful? We're going to look at that. So we're just going to pick up a little bit from Revelation 5. Last week we looked at the throne We talked about that. Why was it written on both sides? Because it was a land contract to earth. And only the person whose name that's written on the outside could open it. And who was that? Christ. The Lamb, Jesus Christ. So these scrolls, they're not like another picture. It has like just 7 seals. Now that's really not how you have to envision it. It's like Jesus is able to break one seal and unravel some of it. And then when that's seen, then he breaks the next seal and it unravels and down the way. And we should be thankful that God continues to give us opportunities to share the gospel with our friends, our loved ones, and even strangers. Because trust me, what's going to happen during those times of tribulation is not something we want anyone to have to endure. When we talked about this, the block of Revelation, from chapter 4 on is all future events. The church is mentioned 19 times up through verse 5. But then it's not mentioned again until chapter 19 when Jesus shows up. The reason for that is the church is not here. The church is raptured before the 7 years of tribulation. And I know there's a lot of people that say, oh, I don't know when it's going to be. But we looked at all the different verses that talk about the church literally being gone. Another misconception is, I think for Christians, sometimes we think that the rapture happens and then the tribulation starts right away. Well, actually, there's no scriptural backing for that. We don't know when the 7 years of tribulation is really going to happen. It could be 5, 10, 15, 20 years or more after. We don't know. Or it can happen right after. That's the whole point. For people who say, oh, well, wait until things get worse. They're not that bad here. Then I'll accept Christ. The rapture could happen at any time. Jesus could come back for his bride tomorrow or 5 years, 10 years from now. We don't know. So we need to always be prepared. Now, the research that I've taken, these are just some of the names of the plethora of people that I have watched and studied throughout all the years. But the late great Chuck Missler, Gary Hamrick, Dr. Thomas Horn, Reverend Donna Howell, Dr. Michael Heiser, and Ron Peterson, just to name a very small few. Well, why I threw this one up is because I said in Revelation there isn't any imagery or any symbols that show up there that have not shown up throughout all the scriptures. Most of them in the Old Testament, but some in the New Testament. Who here has ever heard of the Olivet Discord? Those are big words. It was a powwow that Jesus had with 4 of his disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. He was up on the Mount of Olives, what's called Olivet, and the discord was, they were asking him, they go, Lord, when is all this stuff going to happen? When is all this nasty stuff going to happen? And he sits down and he talks to them. And this is in Matthew 24, right here. He says, there's going to be false Christs. There's going to be wars, famines, death, martyrs, and worldwide chaos. Guess what we're going to look at with the 4 horsemen? Actually, the 6 seals after the 4 horsemen. Same thing. The white horse, false Christ. The red horse, wars. Black horse, famine. Pale horse, death. Martyrs, worldwide chaos. He is telling them in advance in the Gospel of Matthew exactly what John is seeing when the 7 seals are being opened. So it's not new information. He's just seeing it instead of hearing it. Now, I threw this one in from Daniel, if you've done anything with Revelation. You cannot study Revelation without everybody going and looking at the book of Daniel, right? So I'm not going to get into Daniel big time today, but it's Daniel chapter 9. I highly encourage you, go read it. Daniel's having the vision of these 70 weeks, and 69, and then there's this 1 week. Well, the week is 7 years. It's in sevens. So that 1 week of Daniel's vision is that 7 years of tribulation. And the biggest information that we get of the Antichrist comes from Daniel. Now, what I didn't say at the last church that I planned on, he is not actually called the Antichrist by anyone but John. His name is really called the Assyrian. We're going to look at some of the other titles. But Daniel talks about this desolate. He talks about the abomination, and it's a lot of hard words, and you may not understand it, but when I'm done today, it'll make perfect sense. So John says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and then I heard the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come!" which meant actually in Greek it's proceed. I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Right away, you're going, who's the white horse, right? Who's the rider? A lot of Christians mistake this to be Jesus. Jesus does not come on the scene until chapter 19. This is the Antichrist. He has a bow. A bow actually signified peace. Arrows, war. Now, he has arrows, they're just hidden. He's going to come with his banner of peace. He's going to unite the whole world, get everyone behind him in the beginning. It says he has a crown on, but we looked at this last week. It's Stephanos in Greek. Stephanos means like the laurel crowns, the wreaths that you would wear after winning an Olympic game in ancient Greece. They're temporary. They'll die, right? Because they're made out of vegetation. But Jesus' crown is called a diadem, which is signifying royalty, kingship. So here we have the Antichrist who does not have the crown of a king. It's an earthly crown. And some of his titles is the man of lawlessness, the abomination that causes desolation. That's what Daniel talked about. We're going to look at that. The beast, Paul calls him that in 2 Thessalonians, and then we see that again referred in Revelation 13. Now his characteristics. He's an intellectual genius. Of course he is, because he has to orchestrate everything. A persuasive orator. He's going to be very charismatic. He's going to get everybody to swoon over him. He's going to be a shrewd politician, a financial genius, forceful military leader, powerful organizer. What you need somebody who can unite an entire world. When we get to the end, we see that we have one world government, right? How can you possibly have one world government unless you have one person controlling all of that? In 168, I've talked about this several times, but maybe you didn't make the correlation. We talked about Antiochus Epiphanes. This was 168 BC, before Christ. The second temple's been built. This Antiochus figure, he's a solution. He comes up and he tried to make war with Egypt, and he got his rear spanked really bad. He got beat. And he's mad. And so he's coming on up through Israel, and he takes it out on the Jewish people. Besides killing a bunch of Jews, he goes into their temple and he takes a pig and he slaughters it on the altar of God. It doesn't get any worse than that for a Jew. And then they bring in an idol of Zeus and stick it in the Holy of Holies. That's why this is called the abomination of desolation. It's talked about many times. See, Daniel had prophesied that back in his time about Antiochus. But then it's going to happen again in Revelation, because Jesus says, oh, this still hasn't happened. It's going to happen again. Now, just 2 years later, in 166, is when the Maccabees, that's a whole Apocrypha, if you read some of that, the Maccabees, they were a family that were really mad about this. So they rise up and they take over Israel again for God. And they clean out the temple, and they get rid of the pigs, and they get rid of the idol. And that lasts for a while. But then Jesus says, it's not going to last. Okay? So we know that the Antichrist is going to be a man. And Jesus tells us that either he or an idol at halfway through that 7-year tribulation period, that 3.5 years, Satan's going to enter him. Peace will be no more. He's going to walk into the temple, the Holy of Holies, and he's going to declare himself God. That he is the Messiah. Now you have to realize, who is John writing this to?
Jews.
The Jews, that's right. As Christians that have come to Christ, this isn't going to mean anything to us. I mean, it's hearts. We're not going to have to worry about it. But Jesus tells them, he says, when you hear people say, I am the Messiah, or go out in the desert, or go out in the wilderness, or go to the city, for the Messiah is there, he says, don't listen to them. Why? Because he was the Messiah. He said there's going to be many false messiahs. This is what he's talking about. In the end time, you're going to have all these Jewish people that still have not accepted Christ as the Messiah, that's still looking for the Messiah. And they're going to be duped. They're going to run after this false Messiah. He will blaspheme God. He will oppose God. He will exalt himself. He will set himself up in God's temple, proclaiming that he himself is God. And unfortunately, many will fall. So the timing of the Antichrist. As I said, he's going to come to power after the rapture of the church. And he will be overthrown and destroyed by Christ himself when he returns in Revelation 19. Now, I would argue that he probably is walking on the earth right now. And why I say that is because I believe that Satan has raised up an Antichrist figure in every generation in case that happens to be the generation. One could argue that Nero, Hitler, a lot of those were ones that were raised up, but it was not the right time. I do believe he's walking around. We have not seen him yet. I don't think he's come to full fruition on the political scene, but I think he is maybe starting his influence. Why I say that is we know that what does the Antichrist do? He comes offering peace. Yeah. What if we just had take place? We had the prince of the king of Saudi Arabia come to Israel trying to make a peace treaty, right? And I told Kristen then, I said, it isn't going to happen. Because there won't be a peace treaty until the Antichrist shows up. Now, I didn't know that that's what was going to happen to make it fall through. But it did. If you look back just in my time that I've been here and aware of this stuff, there have been multiple peace treaties that have fallen through. You go all the way back to Clinton. I see him because he was the closest one to actually forge a peace treaty, and that was back with Yasser Arafat. And in fact, Yasser was getting 90% of what he wanted, and at the end, he negated it and said, nope, won't do it. Because it wasn't time. So I say that because if you know these things and you look at it through scriptural eyes, you see the world front and you go, keep your eye on that one. Keep your eye on this one. Will we know when they become the Antichrist? No, because we're going to be gone. So hopefully if you get to know, sorry, you need to listen to the rest of the sermon so that way you make sure that you're ready and you won't be here during that time. Well, the second seal, verse 3, there's a fiery red horse. Red is the color of terror and bloodshed and war. Jesus said there will be what? Wars and rumors of wars. And when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come and look. And there before me was a black horse. And his rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage. And do not damage the oil or wine. What does that mean? Every time we see a black horse in Scripture, it means famine. It means economic collapse. We've kind of seen that a little bit, haven't we? But not to the full extent. A quart of wheat for a denarius. A denarius was a full day's wage. So if you were to average that all out to what it would look like now, it's going to cost $200 for a loaf of bread. Now look at what inflation is already doing. We're far from that. Think about how fragile an economy can be. I mean, up until we had COVID, did you ever think that there would be one thing in the world that could happen that overnight would affect everything around the globe? Financially. It was so quick. So it wouldn't take a whole lot. I found some statistics from 2019. That was the latest ones I could find. But back then, it said that 821 million people are food insecure, meaning they're hungry. not getting the food, daily food that they need. And of that, 148 million people are starving. It would not take very much to happen in the world for that to just explode. Now, why did Jesus say the oil and the wine do not harm? Well, back then, for the Jewish people, oil and wine were idioms for wealthy people. And as we know, not everyone is going to be affected. There's always going to be some people at the top of the food chain that won't. As I always brought up, he who owns the gold makes rules, right? Okay, so then when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard a voice, the fourth living creature, say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was the pale horse, and its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. And they were given power over the fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. Now, pale here is not like white, like when all the color washes out. It's actually chloros, which is green. That's where we get the word chlorophyll from. So it's like a pale green. It's the green of death. I thought this was also interesting because he said power was given over a fourth of the earth. Do you realize that that's 2 billion people right now as we stand in our population for war, famine, plagues, and peace? But this is not new. I did not know this. After World War II, more people died from viruses than actually died during the war. After all of that, the chaos and the aftermath of World War II, it said that there was more people that died of influenza and typhoid, which is a virus, a bacteria in the water. I thought that was interesting because my grandfather's grandfather started the little town of Houston, which is 6 miles north of York. It's not there anymore. All that's left is an elevator and an old barn that says Houston on the top. That was the lumberyard. Why that's not there anymore? They got typhoid in the well, and everybody died or moved. So here we see typhoid is still an issue. Also, in the 1800s, the bubonic plague, it took out 60% of Europe's population. That was almost 200 million people. So it would not take too much to have a virus come in after war and all this stuff to take out a fourth of the people. So the fifth seal in verse 8 says, "And the souls of those who were slain, they're going to die for their faith, they're going to be martyred, but they're crying out, they say, 'How long before you avenge our blood?'" And even if you want to, wait a minute. I thought the Christians were going to be raptured back. The first group will be. These are the people that had not accepted Christ before the rapture. These are the people who come to Christ during those horrible years of tribulation, and they will be martyred because they will not accept the mark of the beast. They will not bow down to the idols or to the Antichrist. So they will be martyred. I like the little part of that says that they are under the altar. Their souls are under the altar of God. That He is still covering and blanketing them. But it's also ironic that they're saying, "When will our blood be avenged?" It's like, really? Should have gone up the first time and you wouldn't have to go through all this. But what does Jesus do? He gives them a white robe and He says, "Be patient." And why? Because there's still others that are going to die the way you did. Meaning there are still others that are going to come to Christ. There is still hope. No matter how long it goes and how bad it gets, Jesus is still allowing His judgment to be lengthened so more people can come to Him, lest anyone should perish. And you may say, "Well, I don't understand that. Why would someone knowing this want to live through that time?" Let me ask you about the story of Moses and Pharaoh. How many plagues did Pharaoh have to live through? 10, right? He kept saying his heart was hardened. If he would have let the Israelites go in the beginning, end of story. But he didn't. He kept buckling down and getting madder and angrier, and his heart got harder. And he refused to let the Israelites go, even to the point of losing his out, he takes out after them, and he loses his own life. There are still going to be people that no matter how bad it gets, are still going to have their hearts hardened. The sixth seal says that there's going to be earthquakes and volcanic explosions and meteor showers and asteroids and tsunamis. This was a fun fact that I learned. In 1883, on the Krakatoa Islands in South Pacific, there was a volcano that erupted, and 3,000 miles away you could hear it. In fact, 1,500 miles away, it changed the tides. And 7,000 miles away, it was tidal waves, it changed the tide 7,000 miles away, and it changed the weather for 2 years because of the volcanic ash that was in the earth, in the sky. That's from one volcano. So there's going to be all sorts of volcanoes among everything else. It says the moon will turn like blood. Who here has been watching the blood moons? Guess what? That's not it. If it was, you missed it. We're not going to be here for the blood moon. But this is another interesting fun fact. NASA, the scientists, are scratching their head because the moon is literally starting to turn rust in color. It's turning red, and they don't know why. Because the very elements that would cause it to turn rust, like iron oxide and hematite, that's what's on Mars. That's what makes Mars red. The moon doesn't possess. They have no clue why it is starting to turn red. Oh, but God's the maker of all, right? And then we also know about asteroids. And if you were to talk to NASA, there's tons of asteroids up in the air. I love this last one, though. In 2018, there was actually one that flew just within 2,000 miles of Earth. NASA didn't even know it until it actually passed Earth. I think they should have known that before, right? That's what they're there for. But he talks about the heavens being rolled up as a scroll. Basically, all of the universe is in an upheaval. Here's the last part, though, that is, to me, the saddest thing. It says, when the people saw this, they all hid in caves and rocks. And they said, let the rocks fall on us, so we may die. They didn't say, I'm so sorry. They didn't bow down. They didn't kneel down. They didn't ask for forgiveness. Even up to the last moment, they would rather hide and have the rocks fall on them than to give their life to Christ. How sad is that? Well, we have a choice. You know, I've always said this, even with Chantel, that's how she was brought up. But she reminded us when she was 3. You have 2 choices. In life, you always have 2 choices in everything. You can choose to bow down and kneel to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Or you can choose to deny him. You can choose to run to God, or you can choose to run away from God. You can choose to come to him, or you can choose to hide. It's really not that difficult. And you know, it takes on a whole different picture when you think of these 6 seals through the lens of Christ's love. People say, what kind of a loving God could allow this to happen on earth? A God who gave up his own life so that way each and every person can accept that free gift. It doesn't have to be that way. That's a choice. You know, some people think, because they've sat in these pews their whole life, that by being a pew sitter, I guess you get saved through osmosis. Or because your family were Christians, or you had a Bible-thumping grandma, that you're saved through her. No. It is only through an individual act of asking Christ into your heart that gives you salvation. It's that act from a loving Savior who's willing to stretch out these judgments instead of hide. So as we go about our time of Thanksgiving, be grateful for not just everything He's given us here on earth, but spend this time being grateful that He has given us so much hope and that He has showered His love on us so much that He will literally go to the ends of the earth and to the cross to save each and every one of you.